My name is Elena Vasquez, and I am 28 years old. And 7 months ago, I stood at a podium in a community event venue in Phoenix, Arizona, while the branch manager of my father's bank introduced me as the evening's featured business partner. My father was in the third row. He had been sitting in that room for 40 minutes before Gerald Parks stood up and said my name in a context my father had never heard it used before. I want to start with what my father said when I was 17, because that is where this story begins, and because the beginning is necessary for the ending to carry its full weight. I was 17 and a junior in high school, and I had spent 6 months building what I was calling in my notebook a financial technology idea, which was a software concept for streamlining the loan application process at community banks. I had been interested in financial systems since I was 14 because my parents had struggled with a small business loan application when I was in middle school, and I had watched the process from the outside as a child, watching adults deal with something that was complicated in ways that seemed unnecessary. And I had filed that observation in the part of my brain where observations go when they are waiting to become something useful. By 17, the observation had become a concept, and the concept had become 60 pages of notes and mock ups that I had been building in the hours after homework and on weekends, and that I believed, with the specific, unqualified confidence of a 17-year-old who does not know enough to doubt herself, was something real. I told my father on a Sunday afternoon in October. He was in the kitchen reading the paper, and I sat across from him and I laid out the concept. I told him about the loan processing inefficiencies I had identified. I told him about the software solution I had been designing, and I told him I wanted to build a company around it. He listened. He put the paper down and listened to the whole thing, which I had not expected, because my father was not a patient listener by nature. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Elena, I love you and I want to be honest with you because nobody else is going to be." He said I was unfocused. He said I chased ideas without following through. He said financial technology was a space for people with resources and connections that our family did not have. He said he did not think I had what it would take to build something in a space like that. Then he picked up his paper. I sat at that kitchen table for about 60 seconds after he went back to reading. I thought about 60 pages of notes and 6 months of work, and the specific feeling of having presented something you believe in to someone who has decided to not believe it. Then I said, "Okay." I went to my room, I opened my laptop, I kept working. That was the last time I talked to my father about the company for 11 years. The decision not to tell him was not dramatic. It was not a statement or a declaration or a strategic choice. It was the natural consequence of a conversation that had produced a clear signal about what offering my work up for his assessment was going to cost me. And the calculation was simple. I had limited time and energy, and I could spend it arguing with my father's assessment of my potential, or I could spend it building the thing he assessed. I could not do both at the level either of them required. I chose building. The path from 60 pages of notes at 17 to a functional company at 28 was not a straight line, and I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story that presents success as the natural consequence of perseverance is incomplete. There were years when the building felt like moving through concrete. There were decisions that were wrong and had to be reversed. There was a prototype that I spent 14 months building and then rebuilt from a different architecture because the first one had a fundamental structural problem I had not identified until I was too far into it to avoid the cost of starting over. I studied computer science and finance simultaneously at Arizona State University, working 2 part-time jobs throughout to fund the development work I was doing alongside my coursework. I graduated and went directly to work at a fintech company in Tempe for 3 years, not because it was the plan, but because I needed to learn things I could not learn from my own building, and working inside an existing operation gave me access to how things actually functioned at scale. I started my own company formally at 24. I named it Meridio, which was not named after the bank. The name came first, and the convergence was a coincidence that I have since decided was not a coincidence, but the universe having a specific sense of organizational humor. Meridia was a software platform for community and regional banks that simplified and accelerated the loan application and approval process, reducing the paperwork burden on applicants and the processing burden on bank staff through an integrated digital workflow that I had been designing in various forms since I was 17. The first client came through a contact I had made at the Tempe company, the second through a referral from the first. By year 2, I had 7 clients. By year 3, I had 19. By year 4, I secured a Series A investment that allowed me to build the team properly, and by year 5, Meridio had 41 community bank clients across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. Meridian Community Bank in Phoenix, where my father had been a customer for 22 years, became a client in month 6 of year 5. The business development conversation was Gerald Park, the branch manager, who had come to us through a referral from another Phoenix area bank that had been using the platform for 8 months. Gerald was systematic and careful. His evaluation was good. He ran a trial period. He signed a contract. He had been using the platform for 18 months before the community business recognition dinner. I had not checked the attendee list for the dinner. It was a community event, not a corporate one, and the guest list was drawn from local business owners and community figures, and bank customers. My father was a long-term customer. He had been invited. My mother had bought tickets because she attended these kinds of events and because my father's name had been included on the invitation as a recognized long-term customer. I did not know he was going to be there until Gerald mentioned it in passing the afternoon before the dinner. He said, "I met your father this afternoon. Wonderful man, long-term customer." I said, "My father?" He said, "David Vasquez. He mentioned you're his daughter. Small world." I said, "Yes, small world." I want to tell you what the afternoon before the dinner was like because the internal experience of that afternoon is part of the story, and I have not talked about it publicly before. I sat in my car in the parking structure of the venue for about 20 minutes after Gerald mentioned my father, not because I was afraid, not because I was planning anything, because I needed to sit with the information that my father was going to be in that room the following evening and to understand what I actually felt about that before I went into any professional setting. What I felt was complicated in a way that simple descriptions do not capture. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because the narrative of proving a doubting father wrong tends to come packaged with a feeling of vindication, and what I actually felt was something more textured than vindication. I felt the weight of 11 years, not as a burden, as a thing that had produced something real. 11 years of working on a problem I had identified at 14 and started building a solution to at 17 and had been building every day. The work was real. The company was real. The 41 bank clients were real. My father's opinion at the kitchen table 11 years ago had not made those things less real, and his presence at a dinner where they would be acknowledged was not going to make them more real. What the dinner was going to do was make them visible to him. That was the only thing that was different, and I had to decide how I felt about that before the dinner happened, rather than during it. I decided I felt okay. Not excited in the way I might have expected at 17, imagining this moment, just okay, settled. The work was the work, and the work had produced what it produced, and tomorrow I was going to stand at a podium and talk about it in front of an audience that happened to include my father, and that was a thing that was going to happen, and I was going to be present for it with the same complete attention I brought to every professional situation. I went home. I reviewed my presentation. I went to sleep at a reasonable hour. The dinner was at a venue downtown, a converted warehouse space that a local events company had transformed into the kind of warm, professional setting that community business events in Phoenix tend to favor. Warm lighting and round tables, and a stage at the front with a lectern and a screen for presentations. Gerald had arranged for the Meridio presentation to be second in the program, after the opening remarks and before the dinner service. I arrived at 6:15 and found my table, and spoke with several of the other business honorees, and drank water and monitored the door. My father arrived at 6:40 with my mother, and I watched them be seated from across the room. My mother saw me almost immediately, and her face did the thing it does when she is surprised and simultaneously happy. My father was looking at the program. He had not looked up yet. Gerald opened the program at 7. He gave remarks about the bank's relationship with the community and about what the recognition dinner was meant to celebrate. Then he said he wanted to introduce the evening's featured business partner. He said, "This company has been working with Meridio for 18 months, and I want to tell you what that has meant for us operationally." He said, "Our loan processing time is down 31%. He said, "Our applicant satisfaction scores are up significantly." He said, "This is the kind of partnership that changes how a business operates." He said, "The founder of Meridio is with us tonight, and I want to introduce her." He said, "Elena Vasquez." The room applauded. I stood. I looked at the third row. My father had looked up from the program. The 90 seconds between Gerald saying my name and me reaching the podium are the 90 seconds I have replayed most often in the month since the dinner. Not because of what I saw, because of what I chose to do with what I saw. My father's face in those 90 seconds went through several things that I could observe from across the room, and that I had time to note and file before I reached the podium and turned my attention to the professional task of presenting. He had heard Gerald say the name. He had looked at the stage. He had not immediately connected the name to his daughter, because the context was so far from the context in which he had always heard that name that the connection required a moment to form. Then it formed. I watched it form. His face moved through the forming of it. I looked away. I walked to the podium. I thanked Gerald, and I presented for 25 minutes about Meridio and what we had built and what we were building toward, and why community banks were the right focus for this kind of innovation, and what the metrics from the Meridian partnership represented in terms of what was possible across the sector. I presented with the same complete professional attention I brought to every presentation. I did not look at the third row while I was speaking. I was at work. The third row was not where my work was. When I finished and returned to my table during the applause, my mother was crying, quietly, the way she cried when she was proud of something and did not want to make it about her emotional response. She had known about the company. She had known for years. She had made a separate decision from my father's about what she believed, and she had been to the Meridio office twice and had met the team and had told me on both occasions that she was proud of me. I had not asked her to keep it from him. She had simply understood that the information was mine to share on my timeline, and she had respected that. My father did not come to my table during the dinner. He sat in the third row and ate his dinner, and I watched him occasionally from mine, and he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. He was a man who processed things through stillness, and he was very still. He came to me at the end of the evening when people were gathering coats and saying goodnight. He stood in front of me, and he said, "Elena." I said, "Dad." He said, "How long?" I said, 11 years since I started working on it formally. He said, "And you did not tell me." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because the last time I told you about it, you said I did not have what it takes." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I was wrong." He said it simply, 3 words, the most direct thing my father had ever said to me about anything. I said, "I know you were." He said, "I am sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "I am proud of you." I said, "I know that too." He said, "How can you know that when I have never said it?" I said, "Because you are my father, and I have always known it was in you even when you could not find it." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You are extraordinary." I said, "I had a good reason to work hard." He said, "What was the reason?" I said, "I had something to prove." He said, "To me." I said, "To myself." He needed to understand the distinction, and I needed him to. My father and I have talked more in the 7 months since the dinner than in the previous decade combined. Not because the dinner fixed everything, because it opened something. The dinner made a conversation possible that had not been possible before. Because before the dinner, my father did not have accurate information about what I had built, and without accurate information, the conversation could not happen on honest terms. He visited the Meridio office 3 weeks after the dinner. I showed him around the way I would show anyone around: the development team and the client success team and the data infrastructure that the platform runs on. He asked questions. Some of them were the wrong questions because he did not have the technical background to ask the right ones, but he was asking, and the asking was what mattered. He met my team. He shook hands with my CTO, who he later told my mother was one of the sharpest young men he had met in years. My CTO is 26 and has 3 patents and describes himself as aggressively average-looking in a way that always gets a laugh. My father liked him immediately. He asked me once, about 2 months after the dinner, what I had felt when Gerald said my name. I told him the truth, which was that I had felt settled. He said, "Not vindicated?" I said no. He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because vindication would have meant I needed you to be wrong in order for the work to feel real, and I did not need that. The work was real before you were in the room. Your being in the room just made it visible to you." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I spent 11 years not seeing something real." I said, "You spent 11 years raising me, working, taking care of your family, and living your life. You could not see something I was not showing you." He said, "I told you it would fail." I said, "You told me what you believed at a kitchen table when I was 17. I did not let it be the limit of what I believed. That is the whole story." Gerald Park and I have coffee once a month. He has referred 3 additional banks to Meridio since the dinner. My father has told the story of the dinner to approximately everyone he knows, which I know because people who know my father keep mentioning it to me with the specific warmth of people who are moved by a story about a father finally seeing their daughter clearly. He told my grandfather, his father, who is 83 and still sharp. My grandfather called me after my father told him and said, "Mija, your father is a proud man, and proud men take longer." I said, "I know, abuelo." He said, "He has always been proud of you." I said, "I know." He said, "He just needed to hear it from someone he did not raise." I said, "That is exactly right." He laughed. I laughed. My grandfather understood things about my father that I had been working out for years, and he explained them to me in 2 sentences. Meridio has 63 bank clients now. We are closing a Series B. I have 14 employees and am hiring for 3 more positions. The 60 pages of notes from when I was 17 are in a folder in my desk drawer. I look at them occasionally, not as a reminder of where I started, but as a record of what I understood at 17 that I have been proving out for 11 years since. My father calls on Sundays. We talk about the company and about family and about the things that parents and adult children talk about when they have built a relationship on honest ground, after years on complicated ground. The calls are good. They are the calls I wanted when I was 17 and did not have access to, and that I have now because I built something that made honesty between us possible in a way it had not been. That is what the dinner did. Not prove him wrong, create the condition for honesty. The proof had been accumulating for 11 years. The dinner was just the moment it became visible. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.